Plato was born approximately 427 BCE. He was born to aristocratic parents, and he grew up during the Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 BCE to 399. He engaged in poetry as a youth and later turned to philosophy. He was acquainted with all of the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus, if you remember, he was the one who thought change was constant, and Pythagoras, of course, the mathematician, and Parmenides, who claimed that change was impossible. He was Socrates' student, and he did turn his attention to the question of virtue. He thought that how we think and what we think is real in the world has an impact on how we act. That is, the metaphysics and the epistemology will imply a set of values. And he came to believe that the philosophical attitude led one to become a just and a happy person. After Socrates' death, he left Athens and lived and traveled in Italy. Here we see, from an ancient Roman mosaic from the 2nd century, Plato's Academy. Socratic dialogues were the early dialogues of Plato, and they expressed the ideas and the conversation that he had with his teacher Socrates. These early dialogues include the Crito, Laches, Lysis, Parmenides, Euthyphro, which we saw in the last PowerPoint, Hypatius, Minor and Major, Protagoras, Gorgias, and Ion. This is a very interesting painting by Raphael. It is called the School of Athens. Now, we can tell that it's definitely the Renaissance environment, for that's when perspective was discovered. But apart from the environment, we see two main figures in the center of this painting. An older man, who is Plato, and he's pointing upward. And a younger man, Aristotle, and he's pointing outward. Now notice on your left-hand side, we have a lot of people who are reading, who are contemplating, who are thinking. Those are Plato's students. Notice on the other side of the room, on the right-hand side, we have students who are conversing. Some are looking at a globe, one is looking at his foot. They're trying to discover things through observation rather than contemplation. Here we see a detail of that same painting, the older Plato pointing upward and the younger Aristotle pointing outward. We will soon see a more profound significance to this gesture. The middle dialogues of Plato were the Meno, Euthydemus, Menexenus, Cratylus, Republic, Phaedrus, Symposium, and Phaedo. It was the middle dialogues of Plato that we have the epistemology of Plato, and primarily two main ideas come from these middle dialogues: his theory of forms and his theory of recollection. Just what was his theory of forms? Very interesting. Plato thought that there were two separate worlds. This was how he was able to resolve the problem of change of the pre-Socratics. Do you remember this problem? It was the problem that when things constantly change, you can't know anything. And so in order to claim that you do have knowledge, you must also then claim that things do not change, as did Parmenides. Well, it seems like Plato wanted his cake and eat it too. He wanted to explain both knowledge and change and develop an adequate philosophy that covered and accounted for both change and knowledge. So what did he do? Well, he made the world into two separate spheres. Reality was a transcendent, unchanging realm, and then there was the realm of sensory experience, which was constantly changing. You could not know the realm of sight, sound, hearing, taste, and touch. Those were sensory experiences, and that only yielded opinion. If you really wanted to have knowledge, you had to contemplate the other world, the transcendent world, the world that was separate from the world of sensation. You had to contemplate the world of form. Now, the tangible world of experience, which constantly changes, is only an appearance, and he said that we can only have opinion or doxa of this. Forms, on the other hand, were real. They were divine. They were eternal, meaning they never changed. They were non-corporeal, had no length, breadth, or height. They were rational objects of contemplation that existed apart from any individuals and which were discoverable if we would only contemplate them. How could he make such claims? Well, he's acting on an assumption, and it is this, that the universe is permeated with reason, and that the mind, which is part of the universe and therefore reasonable, can grasp the rational nature of the contemplative object, just as the eye is able to see a glass of Coke, for example, sitting on a table. And here we see now the deeper meaning of Raphael's painting. Knowledge can only be gained through contemplation, according to Plato, and so the followers of Plato are deep in contemplation. The highest form was called eidos, and Plato said it was goodness. Goodness was the highest form, then there was truth, and then there was beauty, and all forms were in a hierarchical relationship to each other. Now the eidos, beauty itself, was apart from the human mind. It existed in that transcendent heavenly world of ideas. It was possible, though, that we could have a concept of beauty. And it was possible that through that concept we recognize the copies of the idea of beauty in our experience of beautiful objects. What's most interesting about this hierarchy of knowledge is Plato had very little regard for art. Why is that? Well, the highest reality was the form itself. The world of sensation was a copy of that highest reality, and art was a copy of a copy. It was twice removed from reality, and so he had little regard for art. The highest form is the good. Good exists, eternal, unchanging, non-corporeal, there apart from any of us for our discovery. I want you to take a little notice that if we pull down one of those O's, we have a notion of God. And this is something that the Christian thinkers later understood. Here we have a diagram where we have objects of knowledge corresponding to objects in reality. On the right-hand side, we have images, and the corresponding kind of knowledge that you can have of images is conjecture, speculation. Then he says the next highest level in the visible world is particular objects. And of those, we can only have a belief. Why? Because the world of sensations, when you look at particular objects, yields only opinion. And you believe when you look at something in the reality of that something. Then he says there is an intelligible world, and this is the transcendent world of forms, whereby we have scientific concepts, and that yields us understanding. But if we contemplate the forms themselves, the essence, the eidos of goodness, truth, and beauty, he says it takes pure reasoning to understand this, and contemplation yields knowledge. We also have at work, especially in the Republic, in the Allegory of the Cave, an analogy of the sunlight, which yields through the light of reason all things visible. He says that when we use our pure reason long enough and with enough discipline to understand the true nature of goodness, that we have an understanding of all of the nature of reality. To know the good was to do the good. Well, we seem to understand readily this idea of image versus reality. Of course, we have television and we do have reality shows, but somehow the reality of the reality shows is not quite as real without the television. We can see the idea of appearance versus reality in this beautiful building, the Parthenon. Plato, while he was growing up, would recognize that in this building there was not a single straight line. All of the building was constructed with curves in order to correct for the problem of parallax. Now you say, well, what does that mean, parallax? Well, when you go downtown and you look at a very tall building and you look up, it looks as though that building converges to a single point. When it's up close, it looks more like a triangle. The Parthenon was designed with the building to curve outward so that when you're up close, it still appears straight. The reality of this building is there is not a single straight line, but the appearance of it tells us that it is perfectly straight. The difference is the difference between appearance and reality. Of course, Plato thinks appearance yields opinion, while Socrates, his teacher, thought that definitions could give you knowledge. Plato solved the problem of infinite regress of his teacher's epistemology by claiming that knowledge isn't always knowledge of something real. There was a definite foundation for knowledge, apart from anyone's perspective. Forms are not definitions, according to Plato. Forms are recollections. Now, this is a very unusual claim. What exactly does he mean? Well, in one of the dialogues that Plato wrote, called the Timaeus, he describes how souls, prior to their birth, mingled with the forms and had full knowledge of all of the forms, full knowledge of goodness, truth, and beauty. And through the trauma of the soul's wedding, shall we say, with material and birth into an individual body, through that trauma, all of the knowledge of the forms was forgotten. So that it took a lifetime of disciplined reason in order to have or regain full knowledge of form. In the Republic, we see an allegory called the myth of the cave. Now, what exactly was this about? This myth shows that people, if they rely on images, they are only going to have a level of knowledge called conjecture. That images cannot yield knowledge, so we're like prisoners. We're imprisoned by our bodies, by our senses, our appetites, and our own ignorance if we stay at that level and think image is the true nature of reality. It's only when those prisoners turn around and use their reason to see that they're being fooled. False images are mistaken for reality. That's not the true nature of reality. And so slowly a person is able to climb out of the cave of their own ignorance through the discipline of reason. And outward is the sun, and this is the metaphor for a knowledge of goodness. The question is, do we prefer pleasant deception? Not everybody likes to take the time to contemplate or to lead a disciplined life enough to understand with depth the nature of goodness, truth, and beauty. And Plato said that a savior, if he went back down into the cave to try to rescue his fellow man, could expect rejection and even death. Now this is a reference perhaps to his teacher Socrates, who was put to death for trying to enlighten the people around him. But it is also a foreshadow, as you see here, when Christ was jeered by the crowd and then crucified. In Plato's philosophy, we have a tripartite model. First, we have the individual, and then analogous to that, we have the state. The part of the individual's soul were the appetitive, the spirited, and the rational parts. The parts of the society were the workers, the soldiers, and the rulers. Now, if we let the soul be governed by the appetites, we become slave to our appetites. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever you might have. We become slaves to that. If we let our emotions rule our soul, we become slaves to our passions. It is only when we allow reason to rule the soul that both the spirited and the appetitive portions are satisfied in moderation. So his truly is a philosophy of moderation. When reason rules, all parts of the soul are satisfied and have virtue. Likewise, when philosophers are rulers, they ensure that all other members of the society, those who are governed primarily by their appetites, the workers, or those who are governed primarily by their spirit, the soldiers, they are all functioning with excellence. They are happy to be doing their best. Freedom, according to Plato, was excellence. And if something other than reason or philosophers ruled, we lost freedom and we lost excellence, and we did not live a healthy, happy, and just lives. When reason rules the soul, a person is free, just, healthy and happy. When reason through the philosopher rules the society, there is justice.